Well, first of all, just to add my own thanks to all of you for turning out on what is a rather dark and rainy night. I'm delighted to see so many of you here. I'm also rather embarrassed to discover that in 10 minutes I was capable of describing some research which has actually taken me 10 years, but never mind. What I'm aiming to do is really, I hope, give you some insight into the journey from working on some clay tablets discovered at the site of ancient Babylon, as you can see up there on the slide, to finally being able to publish the text as a book. I also have to confess to you, I'm like a kid in a sweet shop because I first held this book in my hand today. Okay, so let's investigate a little bit more what this involves. So the text I'm going to talk about, we can call it a calendar treatise, but I should say, first of all, for all scholars, when you work on an ancient text, trying to decide what the text actually is a big question, and there's always a danger that we impose some kind of modern label on something that to the ancient scribes and the readers and hearers of the text was something completely different. So the actual manuscripts that I work with, as you can see up there on the screen, are clay tablets. There's a blow-up of part of one of these tablets there on the left. These are written in the Akkadian language, which is related to Arabic and Hebrew. It's no longer spoken, but was a language primarily of ancient Iraq. And the scribes wrote on clay with reed styluses. And the first thing you have to do is sit there in the British Museum with an angle poised lamp, desperately tilting these things that look a bit like dog biscuits on a bad day, trying to see what the cuneiform signs are and then work out what they mean. So you can see up there on the right-hand side of the screen, one of my hand-drawn copies of a cuneiform tablet. This is very old-fashioned, but this is still what we largely do. Obviously, digital photography is great, and we're more and more using digital photographs, but I still think there's nothing quite like copying a tablet by hand to really make you look at it and think about what the signs actually are. Now, when I first started working on this, some pieces of the text had been published in 1902, but not much had been done on them since then. And then I also found some more manuscripts in the British Museum which were unpublished. So I was dealing with a jigsaw. As you can see from the image up there on the left on the screen, many of these tablets were broken. So it was also a case of literally joining broken pieces of clay tablet together. You're working in the British Museum, which overall has about 120,000 cuneiform tablets and fragments. So this is quite a jigsaw. Anyway, I realized that on this text, as you can see on the slide here, there were some rulings. And what I realized was that each section was about a different month of the year. So I was able to see that the text had the structure of a calendar. Now, the first material that I was able to read on this tablet concerned a battle between the gods. This was the warrior hero Marduk, god of Babylon. You can see him up there on the slide on the left. And his chief enemy in the text was a female deity called Tiamtu, who is the deified sea. And I first of all found I was reading a passage of Akkadian poetry describing their battle. And this was very interesting, but it was also rather weird because it was a very short account. We know a lot about this from a long epic poem on 7 tablets, but here was a compressed version. So what were they doing? Why was it there? Why was it in a text that was structured according to the months of the year? Then I discovered that also on this tablet there was a lot of information about warring kings, human kings fighting, and the two main protagonists here were the king of Babylon, which is a kind of human parallel to Marduk, who was the god of Babylon, and the king of Elam. You can see Elam marked there with the red arrow on the map. So this is ancient Iran over there in the east. And what I discovered was that this tablet was really interested in some historic battles that had been fought probably 1,000 years or so before these tablets, or more than that, even 1,500 years before these tablets were written. So what it was doing was it was drawing together all sorts of material from history about these human battles. And yet I could see that the tablets themselves were very late. They probably date from the period of Greek control over Babylonia. So why were the scholars sitting there in Babylonia under Greek rule suddenly so interested in all these battles that had happened about 1,000 years before? So really, the more I was able to read, the more baffled I got about what this text was actually about. Woven in amongst it all, I also found a lot of material about observations, looking up at the night sky, observing the movements of the planets and the constellations. And these were a very key part of divination in ancient Babylonia. So by looking up at the movements of the stars, they believed that they could see messages from the gods about the future. So by looking at the stars, you could see what was going to happen. And up there on the screen, you've got one of these omens. In the month Duuzu, this is the 4th month of the year, when he performed in Babylon a ritual to defeat an enemy, because Mars and the moon, the lords of secret knowledge of Elam, that's that country out there in the east, had maximum latitude, and Jupiter and the sun, lords of the secret knowledge of Babylonia, had minimum latitude. They, these planets, revealed an omen portending the changing of Babylon's reign. And the reign change was going to come about through Elam invading Babylonia. So here we had an omen. And what they did, as well as reading these messages from the stars, much like us, and indeed many of our concepts of constellations come from the Babylonians, they joined up these stars they could see in the sky into images. And you can see there on the screen, I hope it's at least a little bit clear, this is a tablet from Uruk from the Hellenistic period, and there's a drawing of the constellation Leo. Can you see the lion striding along the back of the Hydra? This is the constellation Hydra. And the star that you can see there, up here, this is the planet Jupiter. And they thought that Jupiter was the planet of the god Marduk, and that basically all sorts of battles between the gods were being fought up there in the night sky, if you knew how to read them. And as I say, many of our ideas of constellations actually come from the classical world, but they themselves then have their root in ancient Mesopotamia. You have to keep going east if you want to get back to the beginning of things. In amongst too, there were rituals how to protect Babylon and the temple of Marduk called Esagil from foreign invasion. So here is an example of one of the rituals. In the month Tashritu, this was month 7 of the year, on day 6, very precise here, not day 5, not day 7, day 6, when a fire was lit on top of a brick and it was thrown into the river, instead of the Elamite or the Assyrian who would otherwise enter Babylon and destroy the city, its brick is burnt with fire and hurled into the water. So there's this idea here that one brick can simulate the whole city. And if in a very controlled ritual way you set fire to a brick, you hurl it in the river, you will have satisfied that omen in the sky that the whole city will be destroyed and Babylon will be safe. And I have to confess to you, the picture of the brick on the slide is actually much, much earlier, but I couldn't resist it because it's one of these bricks where unfortunately a dog walked across it before it was dry. You can see those paw prints. So I had all this information and it was all kind of stuck together in this text by all sorts of wordplay and puns. But I was left asking myself, what, who, where, when, and why? So I could classify this text as a calendar treatise. This is a bit arbitrary. Other scholars might decide it's something else, on rituals to stop enemies invading Babylon. I could tell from the date of the tablets and the handwriting that it was written and copied by scholars who were linked with Marduk's Esagil temple. The link with the temple comes from the content of the text because it's very focused on temple rituals and protecting the temple. The tablets we have come from the late 1st millennium BC, and the scribes used to write notes at the bottom, often giving their names and whether they've copied the tablet from an earlier source. 2 of them are probably from about 170 BC, so probably composed when Babylonia was part of the Hellenistic Empire. And what these scribes were doing, At this stage of Babylonia's history, those temples writing cuneiform, understanding Akkadian, was dwindling and shrinking. It had become much less important in this wider reach of the Hellenistic world. They were finding a common cause between those temple scholars and the imperial rulers of Babylonia, the security of Babylon. So these scholars were aiming to boost the fading prestige of their temple and, I should say, protect their own careers and their professions. But did it work? Well, to wrap up, we can think about the Temple of Esagil in terms of its prestige and the memory of this temple. You can see there on the left of the slide a drawing from the last century, a quite careful reconstruction. And up here is the ziggurat of the Esagil temple. And of course, this has a big role to play in cultural memory because this is the Tower of Babel. This originally is the ziggurat of Esagil. And I'm also very pleased to say that I was able to use on the cover of my book this aerial photograph of where that ziggurat used to stand. All the bricks have been robbed out, and now you just see a water-filled ditch with reeds. But nonetheless, memories of that temple have indeed carried on. Thank you all very much.